root cause of intolerance, religious intolerance in Nigeria?
Well, the British...
And what is the history of religious intolerance in Nigeria?
I always say this, that one, we should not forget that the British were imperialists. They had their own agenda, which was the exploitation of the colonies for the good of the motherland. Therefore, in their dealings with the colonies, their primary concern was that agenda. Other things were fitted in so long as they promoted the main agenda of exploiting the colonies for the good of the motherland. In the matters of religion, the British allowed missionaries to go ahead and evangelize the southern parts of the country. They barred them from Christianizing the Muslim part. Now that meant that they were responsible for the dichotomy between Muslims and Christians. Now, as for intolerance, intolerance grew out over the years, because once you established that tradition that some parts are Muslims and they must not be Christianized, right? If you then attempted to Christianize that part, it's like you were breaking an agreement. Although the agreement was between the British and them, not between Nigerians and Nigerians. All right, but over the years, that became a mindset of the people. Now, and in the colonial period, there really was no problem, because there was a super authority that controlled these matters. What, of course, was to happen was that at independence, all right, power was transferred in such a way that that power went into the hands of Muslims. Now, consequently, they had a chance to decide what happened thereafter. So the agenda altered at independence, and intolerance began to grow more in the period of post-independent Nigeria than in the pre-independent colonial state.
Okay. Now, historically, what is the way forward for Christians and Muslims in this country?
You can also look at the agenda of Arabization and Islamization. Post-independence, has it continued?
I want to build up that one before I go to. Okay.
Yes.
Historically, what is because it's like the Christians are giving more than the other side. It's like if you check the killing patterns. It was only a few years ago that they say Christians fought back.
Started responding.
Whereas from the 50s, we are the first, due to what when Nahoro passed
the motion,
then all that and followed a pattern whereby instead of it to be a political something, it was normally after Christians, burning of churches.
Well, it is important for us to remember that Christianity came first through the seas, and so came the southern part of Nigeria. And what we received as Christianity was not just church. It was church, education, agriculture, and so on. A more holistic, the missions came with a full package to the south. And what that meant, of course, was that a Western European education took root in the south, almost half a century before it took root in the northern parts. There was therefore, in terms of Western European education, a clear dichotomy again between south and north. Now, the paradox was this. Here were the British, all right, saying don't interfere with the religion of the caliphate, and yet their whole administrative structure and activity was based on a non-Muslim culture, Western European education. Okay? So as the country developed through the colonial period, the persons who were imbibing the culture of administration of the colonial masters were Southerners and Middle Belters. Right? The British were protecting the North from that culture, which the North needed for them to be effective in administration of the new Nigeria that was going to be born. At the time, therefore, that Nigeria was born, there was a clear inequity between the manpower needs of Nigeria in terms of North and South, because the South had produced certain kinds of people, the North had not. And so you began to have problems of how to deal with this situation. And our politicians were faced with that problem. And because we were a federation, they had to find some way of making the thing work. That's why you find that standards were different as between these two groups of people. So over time, we had a state in which the less educated in Western European education had political power over the more educated South, because of the way Nigeria was then divided. North, monolithic. South split into two, East and West, such that you began to have built up what I call different groups, three different groups in the country, each of them having allegiance. The West had allegiance to the West, the East to the East, the North to the North. But the North was big enough to swallow up the East and the West. And this is where the problem of intolerance began to come. How do you handle this kind of situation, where folks had education, they had experience, others didn't have, but they have to have political power? Okay. So, educational imbalance fueled, if you like, religious intolerance. And the goal was power, and that power had to be, so it was fought in the Muslim North. That's how you find even Sokoto state in our time had as its born to rule. You know, only born to rule. Now that is a mindset that comes from the jihad. They were born to rule. So if they don't rule, there's trouble. Okay? I'm sorry, they didn't think too hard about that when they put it on. Sokoto State born to rule. But it just tells you where they're coming from. And as competition for positions intensified, so intolerance developed more. And what manifested as religious intolerance was actually the contest for power in the civil service, in political appointments, and so on. And the problem which the nation faced was and is, how do you contain these divergences and yet give a measure of justice? to different groups within the state system. That remains our problem even now.
Now, in that kind of situation where we find ourselves, is the Arabization of Nigeria, is it a concept or a reality?
And then also, I just want to say, you know where to put it in. The Glover Act, the so-called remarkable division of the East and the West today, is something that we can trace to the Glover Act, when they divided. The whole of the South was administered as one at one time. And then all of a sudden the divisions began to come. The engineering behind the division, was it a deliberate thing, or was it just to administer the South in different parts? Because we also believe that some of the divide between the East and the West today was a result of social engineering of the British. Because then a struggle for resources came, a struggle to further identify yourself as Midwest, I'm Northwest, I'm Midwest, I'm East, I'm that. It was not as pronounced in the earlier, I think the Global Act came in 50-something. It wasn't as pronounced in the earlier years as it has become in recent years. I don't know whether that is pertinent.
Other mind, when you link it to the idea of if it's a deliberate, like we know that there's been a concept in the Muslim world to rule. Just like the Sokoto saying, born to rule, without really knowing. It's an influence they have. And that means they will do anything to rule. Failing to understand that Nigeria has been a nation that they themselves did not conquer all. Even the Middle Belt did not conquer the Middle Belt. The British have helped them so much. But we come to the modern times from after independence till now.
Military years.
The military years is because of they have had the rulership, and they were able to drag us into OIC, and they were able to do certain other things. Is there a kind of inbuilt policy?
Okay, within the
structure,
the foundation of the structure
that
has assisted one side to win.
To assist them not to always be winning, because they've been. Most of these things they've been getting their way. In every situation they say leave them.
So can it be connected back to the foundation you just built?
Yeah. Clearly the way that the British ran Nigeria, the things they did, the nature of the constitutions that were drawn up was such as to favor the North. For example, the argument for dividing the